We're in chapter 5, and in your book, these thoughts are on the top of page 135, which is where we'll be starting. I awoke on the floor with my hands tied to the cooking range. The girl was pacing nervously and appeared to be having an animated conversation with herself. I kept my eyes most of the way shut and listened. He must be a white, she was saying. Why else would he be snooping around the old house like a burglar? I haven't the slightest idea, someone else said, but neither, it seems, does he. So she wasn't talking to herself after all, though from where I was lying, I couldn't see the young man who'd spoken. You say he didn't even realize he was in a loop? See for yourself, she said, gesturing toward me. Can you imagine any relative of Abe's being so perfectly clueless? Can you imagine a white? Said the young man. I turned my head slightly, scanning the room, but I still didn't see him. I can imagine a white faking it, the girl replied. The dog, awake now, trotted over and began to lick my face. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to ignore it, but the tongue bath he gave me was so slobbery and gross that I finally had to sit up just to rescue myself. Well, look who's up, the girl said. She clapped her hands, giving me a sarcastic round of applause. That was quite the performance you gave earlier. I particularly enjoyed the fainting. I'm sure the theater lost a fine actor when you chose to devote yourself instead to murder and cannibalism. I opened my mouth to protest my innocence and stopped when I noticed a cup floating toward me. Have some water, the young man said. Can't have you dying before we get you to the head mistress now, can we? His voice seemed to come from the empty air. I reached for the cup, and as my pinky brushed an unseen hand, I nearly dropped it. He's clumsy, the young man said. You're invisible? I replied dumbly. Indeed. Millard Nulling's at your service. Don't tell him your name, the girl cried. And this is Emma, he continued. She's a bit paranoid, as I'm sure you've gathered. Emma glared at him, or at the space I imagined him to occupy, but said nothing. The cup shook in my hand. I began another fumbling attempt to explain myself, but was interrupted by angry voices from outside the window. Quiet, Emma hissed. Millard's footsteps moved to the window, and the blinds parted an inch. What's happening? Asked Emma. They're searching the houses, he replied. We can't stay here much longer. Well, we can't very well go out there. I think perhaps we can, he said. Just to be certain, though, let me consult my book. The blinds fell close again, and I saw a small leather-bound notebook rise from a table and crack open in mid-air. Millard hummed as he flipped the pages. A minute later, he snapped the book shut. As I suspected, he said, we only wait we only to wait a minute or so, and we can walk straight out the front door. Are you mad? Emma said. We'll have every one of those knuckle draggers on us with brickbats. Not if we're less interesting than what's about to happen, he replied. I assure you, this is the best opportunity we'll have for hours. I was untied from the range and led to the door, where we crouched, waiting. Then came a noise from outside even louder than the men's shoutings. Engines, dozens by the sound of it. Oh, Millard, that's brilliant, cried Emma. He sniffed. And you said my studies were a waste of time. Emma put her hand on the doorknob and then turned to me. Take my arm. Don't run. Act like nothing's the matter. She put away her knife, but assured me that if I tried to escape, I would see it again, just before she killed me with it. How do you know you won't anyway? She thought for a moment. You don't. And then she pushed open the door. The street outside was thronged with people. Not only the men from the pub, whom I spotted immediately just down the block, but grim-faced shopkeepers and women and cart drivers who'd stopped what they were doing to stand in the middle of the road and crane their heads toward the sky. There, not far overhead, A squadron of Nazi fighter planes was roaring by in perfect formation. I'd seen photos of planes like these at Martin's museum, in a display titled Cairnholm Under Siege. How strange I must be, I thought, to find yourself in the midst of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, suddenly in the shadow of enemy death machines that could rain fire down upon you at a moment's notice. We crossed the street as casually as possible, Emma clutching my arm with a death grip. We nearly made it to the alley on the other side before someone finally noticed us. I heard a shout, and we turned to see the men start after us. We ran. The alley was narrow and lined with stables. We'd covered half its length when I heard Miller say, "I'll hang back and trip them up. Meet me behind the pub in precisely 5.5 minutes." His footsteps fell away behind us, and when we reached the end of the alley, Emma stopped me. We looked back to see a length of rope uncoil itself and float across the gravel at ankle height. I pulled it taut just as the mob reached it, and they went sprawling over it and into the mud, a tangled heap of flailing limbs. Emma let out a cheer, and I was almost certain I could hear Millard laughing. We ran on. I didn't know why Emma had agreed to meet Millard at the priest hole, since it was in the direction of the harbor and not the house. But since I couldn't explain how Millard had known exactly when those planes were going to fly over, I didn't bother asking. I was even more baffled when instead of sneaking around the back, any hope of our passing undetected was dashed by Emma pushing me right through the front door. There was no one inside but the bartender. I turned and hid my face. "Barman," Emma said, "when's the tap open round here? I'm thirsty as a bloody mermaid." He laughed. "I ain't in the custom of serving little girls." "Never mind that," she cried, slapping her hand on the bar. "Pour me a quadruple dram of your finest cask-strength whiskey, and none of that frightful watered-down stuff you generally serve." I began to get the feeling she was just messing around. Taking the piss, I should say, trying to one-up Millard and his rope across the alley trick. The bartender leaned across the bar. "So it's the hard stuff you're wanting, is it?" he said, grinning lecherously. "Just don't let your mom and dad hear, or I'll have the priest and constable after me both." He fetched a bottle of something dark and evil-looking and began pouring her a tumbler full. "What about your friend here? Drunk as a deacon already, I suppose?" I pretended to study the fireplace. "Shy one, isn't he?" said the barman. "Where's he from?" "Says he's from the future," Emma replied. "I say he's mad as a box of weasels." A strange look came over the bartender's face. "Says he's what?" he asked. And then he must have recognized me, because he gave a shout, slammed down the whiskey bottle, and began to scramble toward me. I was poised to run, but before the bartender could even get out from behind the bar, Emma had upended the drink he'd poured her, spilling brown liquor everywhere. Then she did something amazing. She held her hand, palm side down, just above the alcohol-soaked bar, and a moment later a wall of foot-high flames erupted. The bartender howled and began beating at the wall of fire with his towel. "This way, prisoner," Emma announced, and hooking my arm, she pulled me toward the fireplace. "Now give me a hand. Pry and lift." She knelt and wedged her fingers into a crack that ran along the floor. I jammed my fingers in beside hers, and together we lifted a small section, revealing a hole about the width of my shoulders. A priest hole. As smoke filled the room and the bartender struggled to put out the flames, we lowered ourselves down one after another and disappeared. The priest hole was little more than a shaft that dropped about 4 feet to a crawl space. It was pure black down there. But the next thing I knew, I was filled with soft orange light. Emma had made a torch of her hand, a tiny ball of flame that seemed to hover just above her palm. I gaped at it, all else forgotten. "Move it," she barked, giving me a shove. "There's a door up ahead." I shuffled forward until the crawl space came to a dead end. Then Emma pushed past me, sat down on her butt, and kicked the walls with both heels. It fell open into daylight. "There you are," I heard Millard say as we crawled into an alley. "Can't resist the spectacle, can you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," replied Emma, though I could tell she was pleased with herself. Millard led us to a horse-drawn wagon that seemed to be waiting just for us. We crawled into the back, stowing away beneath the tarpaulin. In what seemed like no time, a man walked up and climbed onto the horse, flicked its reins, and we lurched into juddering motion. We rode in silence for a while. I could tell from the changing noises around us that we were headed out of town. I worked up the courage to ask, "How'd you know about the wagon? And the planes? Are you a psychic or something?" Emma snickered. "Hardly." "Because it all happened yesterday," Millard answered. "And the day before that. Isn't that how things go in your loop?" "My what?" "He isn't from any loop," Emma said, keeping her voice low. "I keep telling you, he's a darn white." "I think not. A white never would have let you take him alive." "See," I whispered, "I'm not whatever you said. I'm Jacob." "We'll just see about that. Now keep quiet." And she reached up and peeled back the tarpaulin a little, revealing a blue stripe of shifting sky.